30 April 1945. 9 meters below a city that no longer exists in any recognizable form, a series of cramped concrete rooms hum with the sound of a failing diesel generator. Above ground, the Reich Chancellery garden has become a lunar landscape of shell craters and broken masonry. Soviet artillery is close enough now that the impacts register as a physical pressure through the floor rather than a sound. In a small map room, a handful of exhausted officers stand around a table covered in colored pins that represent armies which, in most cases, no longer exist. Somewhere along a narrow corridor lined with pipework and emergency lighting, a single gunshot is muffled by 2 thick doors and the general chaos of a headquarters in its final hours. It barely registers as unusual. By this stage, unusual has become the ordinary condition of life underground. This is the Führerbunker, the last physical expression of a regime that had, within a few short years, remade the map of Europe and then watched that map dissolve beneath its feet. It was, in engineering terms, an unremarkable structure. A reinforced concrete box, smaller than a modest family house, with none of the scale or sophistication of the great fortifications built elsewhere in the war. And yet it became something far more significant than its dimensions suggest: the physical endpoint of Nazi Germany, the place where the machinery of a global war finally ran out of road. Understanding how it was built, why it was needed, and what happened inside it during its final weeks tells us something the history books rarely capture in full. Not the story of a great weapon or a brilliant strategy, but the story of a system collapsing in on itself, 1 meter of concrete at a time. By the early months of 1945, Germany's war leadership faced a problem that no amount of ideology could solve. There was, quite simply, nowhere safe left to work. The Reich Chancellery, Hitler's seat of government since 1933, sat in the heart of Berlin, and Berlin had become one of the most heavily bombed cities on Earth. Allied bombing raids, particularly the sustained campaign by RAF Bomber Command and the United States Army Air Forces from 1943 onward, had reduced entire districts to rubble. Estimates suggest that by early 1945, roughly 1/3 of Berlin's buildings had been destroyed or rendered uninhabitable, with the government quarter around the Wilhelmstrasse suffering especially heavy damage. Existing shelters beneath the Chancellery, adequate for the sporadic raids of the late 1930s, simply could not withstand the tonnage now being dropped nightly. The problem went beyond bombs. As the war turned decisively against Germany following the catastrophic losses at Stalingrad and Kursk, and as Allied forces closed in from both east and west through 1944, the German High Command needed somewhere that could function as a genuine command center under siege conditions. Somewhere with communications, sleeping quarters, medical facilities, and enough structural integrity to survive a direct hit from the heaviest ordnance the Allies were using. Existing bunkers scattered across the government quarter were either too small, too shallow, or too exposed. The solution that emerged was not a single grand fortress but a layered, expanding complex, built and rebuilt in stages as the military situation deteriorated and the definition of safe kept shrinking. The structure that resulted was designed and expanded under the direction of architects and engineers working for the Reich, drawing on standard German bunker construction techniques developed for military use throughout the war. An initial shelter, sometimes referred to as the Führerbunker, was built beneath the old Chancellery Garden in 1936, intended as a temporary air raid shelter for Hitler and his staff. It was a modest structure by wartime standards, with walls roughly 1.5 meters thick. As the bombing intensified through 1943, this was judged wholly insufficient, and construction began on a second, deeper structure directly beneath and connected to the first, the Führerbunker proper, completed in its final form in 1944 and reinforced further into early 1945. This lower bunker sat roughly 8.5 meters below ground, its ceiling formed from reinforced concrete slabs some 3 meters thick, comparable in terms of sheer mass, to stacking 6 family cars one on top of another across every square meter of roof. The walls were similarly formidable, engineered to withstand the concussive force of the largest conventional bombs then in use. Inside, the complex ran to somewhere in the region of 30 rooms across its 2 levels, connected by a narrow central corridor barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. Ventilation was provided by a diesel-powered air filtration and pumping system, essential not only for breathable air so far underground but for maintaining pressure that could keep gas or smoke from reaching the lower levels during an attack. Electricity came from the same diesel generator, a temperamental piece of machinery that by April 1945 was struggling to cope with the demands placed on it by additional communications equipment crammed into every available space. Life inside was reduced to the scale of the rooms themselves. The map room where military briefings took place was barely large enough for a table and a dozen standing officers. Sleeping quarters were closet-sized, allocated according to rank and proximity to the center of power. Water came from a well sunk specifically to serve the complex, since the city's main supply had become wholly unreliable under the weight of bombardment. Telephone and radio links connected the bunker to what remained of the German military apparatus, though by the final weeks those links were reporting on armies that existed largely on paper, divisions reduced to a few hundred exhausted men, supply lines that no longer supplied anything. Construction of the reinforcements in this final phase was overseen using labor drawn in part from forced work details, a detail the post-war reckoning would treat as inseparable from the physical description of the structure itself, since the concrete corridors of the regime's last redoubt were built, in part, by people the regime itself had enslaved. If you're finding this account of one of history's strangest surviving structures interesting so far, a quick subscribe genuinely helps more than you might think. Operationally, the bunker's final and most intensively documented weeks ran from mid-January 1945, when Hitler relocated there permanently, through to the end of April. Daily military briefings, once held with some pretense of strategic coherence, increasingly became exercises in denial, with situation maps showing counterattacks by forces that field commanders knew to be fictions of paper strength. Visitors during this period included senior figures such as Joseph Goebbels, who moved into the complex with his family in the final fortnight, and Martin Bormann, whose control over access to Hitler tightened as the circle of those still willing to deliver bad news grew smaller. Accounts from surviving staff, including secretaries and adjutants who gave testimony after the war, describe an atmosphere that swung between rigid formality and mounting hysteria, with the muffled thud of Soviet artillery becoming a near-constant backdrop by mid-April as the Red Army's assault on Berlin closed the remaining distance to the city center. Precise details of daily life inside remain patchy by nature. Many records were destroyed, and surviving accounts sometimes conflict on timing and sequence. What is well documented is the broad arc. Hitler's marriage to Eva Braun in the early hours of April 29th, the drafting of his political testament that same night, and the deaths of Hitler and Braun on April 30th, followed within days by the deaths of the Goebbels family elsewhere in the complex. Soviet forces reached the Reich Chancellery grounds within days, and organized German resistance in Berlin collapsed entirely by May 2nd. It is worth placing the bunker alongside its contemporaries to understand what made it distinctive and what did not. The British equivalent, the cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall, offered comparable underground protection for wartime leadership, but operated within a functioning capital, supported by a state that retained full command of its logistics and communications throughout the war, a fundamentally different situation from a headquarters operating amid a city under direct ground assault. Hitler's own earlier command posts, such as the Wolfschanze in East Prussia, were considerably larger and more sophisticated in their engineering, built with the resources and confidence of a regime still expecting victory. The Führerbunker, by contrast, was a product of retreat, its construction schedule dictated not by strategic planning, but by the shrinking perimeter of what remained defensible. Where German engineers elsewhere had produced enormous flak tower complexes and U-boat pens with walls several meters thick and space for thousands, the Führerbunker's modest scale reflected a leadership reduced to defending a few hundred square meters of ground beneath a single garden. It was never intended, unlike some of the larger Atlantic wall fortifications, to project strength. It was designed purely to preserve it, for as long as possible, in the smallest space achievable. The historical impact of the bunker itself is, in purely material terms, minimal. It altered no battles, changed no strategic outcomes. Its significance lies instead in what it represents: the physical shrinking of a regime that had once controlled a continent down to a handful of underground rooms. Psychologically, its story has taken on outsized weight in post-war memory precisely because it offers such a stark, contained symbol of collapse, a single traceable location where an enormous historical catastrophe reached its endpoint. Soviet forces demolished much of the structure in the years following the war, and East German authorities later flattened the site further during redevelopment, wary of it becoming any kind of monument. Today, the location sits beneath an unremarkable car park and residential development in central Berlin, marked only by a small, deliberately understated information board, a decision that reflects a broader German approach to sites associated with the regime, prioritizing quiet historical accuracy over anything resembling commemoration. Fragments of bunker structures do survive elsewhere in the city and can be viewed in select underground tours and museum contexts, offering a tangible sense of the cramped, functional spaces that housed the regime's final days. Return for a moment to that muffled gunshot in a corridor 9 meters below a dying city. It did not end a war. The war, in the wider sense, had already been lost weeks or months before, decided on battlefields and in factories and in the calculations of generals far from Berlin. What that single sound in that single corridor marked was something narrower and, in its way, more final: the end of a single life at the center of an ideology that had cost tens of millions of others theirs. The concrete walls that had been built, reinforced, and rebuilt to withstand the heaviest bombs of the age proved entirely capable of doing their one job: protecting the people inside from Allied ordnance. What they could not do was hold back the consequences of everything that regime had set in motion. No thickness of concrete, no depth of excavation, no ventilation system or backup generator could insulate the war's architects from the outcome of the war itself. The Führerbunker was never a great feat of engineering, and it was never meant to be remembered as one. It was a shelter built by a shrinking regime for a shrinking purpose, expanded in careful stages as the definition of safety kept contracting along with the borders of the Reich. Its rooms were small because the world available to the people inside them had become small. Its walls were thick because the threats outside had become at last entirely real and entirely inescapable. What began as a temporary air raid precaution in 1936 ended, 9 years later, as the final address of a project that had promised to last 1,000 years and instead lasted 12. Today, there is nothing to see. A car park, a quiet street, a small sign, easy to miss if you are not looking for it. That absence, more than any surviving ruin, may be the most fitting monument of all. A regime that filled Europe with monuments to itself, reduced in the end to a patch of ordinary German pavement, indistinguishable deliberately from anywhere.